Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alistair.
And in this fortnight's episode, we'll be talking about the new super meta cartoon film Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers, a revamp of something I didn't realise how much I remembered till I saw the intro in this film. And then we'll be talking about the new comic Step by Bloody Step by podcast favourite Cy Spurrier and artist Mateus Bagara, an entirely wordless comic. But before all of that, Alistair, what else have you been dealing with in your time off?
Well, I've been watching a new show that's been getting a fair amount of media attention and some buzz. It's on Disney Plus, although it's not very Disney brand. This is the show Pistol, which is Danny Boyle's drama about the storytelling of Sex Pistols, the notorious punk band from the 70s. It's sort of 6 episodes. It chronicles their rise, their infamy, their controversy, and also weaves it into the story of the period, bringing in all the sort of things, a little bit about politics, although it could have more of the politics of the period in, but more of the kind of cultural malaise of the 70s and the sense of decay and things breaking down that the kind of punk really injected some energy into. It's Danny Boyle, so he is a good director, got a brilliant visual style. The cast is incredibly strong. Anton Boone playing John Lydon, aka Johnny Rotten, is scarily good as Johnny Rotten. He's absolutely nailed the mannerisms and sort of anarchic energy. Very strong cast across the board. Sydney Chander as Chrissy Hines is great. Maisie Williams is in it as well. Even Dylan Llewellyn from Derry Girls has a sort of cameo appearance as an early Sex Pistols member who gets kicked out for wearing glasses by Malcolm McLaren.
It sounds like his character hasn't moved on much since Derry Girls then.
No, he's still playing the sort of awkward guy who doesn't quite fit in and other people find a bit of a drag. But yeah, they really, I guess all the sort of historic people, they really cast them very well and people really kind of got their characters and their mannerisms down. It's completely believable. Yeah, another shout out should go to Thomas Brodie Sangster, who most people know as he's the kid in Love Actually, but he plays Malcolm McLaren in this. And yeah, he's again scarily on it with the sort of mannerisms and the way he talked in the sort of grandiose way he sort of described how a band could bring about the revolution. Yeah, if you're interested in punk music, the 70s, anything that sort of vibe, I can highly recommend Pistol.
Okay, I know nothing about punk music, the 70s, or the vibe, but I have seen a lot of people talking about this. This does seem to have picked up some traction.
It's very well done. I think that's one of the things that is cutting through and is generating interest on social media and in the papers and things like that. To be clear, you don't have to know about this sort of stuff. You can just approach it as, historical drama. There's no sort of prior knowledge needed. And I'm sure most people have at least heard some Sex Pistols songs from, Anarchy in the UK, God Save the Queen. You don't really need to know the detailed history to really appreciate this because, I guess it is accessible in that regard. I think it's just very well executed. It's very compelling drama series. The kind of acting is very good. The characters are good. You kind of really get invested, even though in some levels Sex Pistols were quite dislikable, and certainly John Lydon now has become a slightly vile person. He's like a Trump supporter and things like that. And he's a sort of lifelong provocateur. And now the way to kind of shock people, he shocked the establishment in the in the 70s by wearing pins in his clothes and swearing on TV. And now the way I guess they feel you shock the establishment is by supporting Trump and wearing MAGA hats. And obviously that leaves aside the story of Sid Vicious, who is also quite a nasty character. But still, you get weirdly invested in these young tearaways and their plan to basically shake up music and, let their voices be heard. These shouts of anger of a sort of oppressed and forgotten generation. You can really get caught up in it.
Okay, so it's not feeling like an overly sanitised history. It doesn't feel like they're, looking at it through weird, dewy eyes and cutting out all the rough edges. Yeah,
I was worried that it would be, too much of a hagiography or, sanitize it and play too much on, retro fun. Isn't this kind of kitchen fun retro stuff? And certainly as the show goes on and things get darker, especially after Sid Vicious joins the band, they do get across just how violent and disturbed he was, and he would sort of, smash a beer bottle into someone's face in a bar with minimum provocation. And the drugs get more serious and they start using heavier drugs and things will spiral out of control. So it's definitely not a sanitized version, and kind of shows they were kind of kids from the streets in some cases. These were kind of young, poor, angry people with no future, and it kind of all went into the music. So you can really get caught up in that, but without it being sanitized.
Okay, good. That sounds like probably the best possible version of this, I guess. Short of making a really, really grim, borderline horror version.
Yeah. The Sex Pistols have been captured before. There's a film called Sid and Nancy about Sid Vicious and Nancy Spungen and their sort of dysfunctional, destructive relationship. But I feel this is probably one that kind of encapsulates the whole story. Interestingly, it's kind of told from the perspective of the guitarist Steve Jones, crucially not making John Lydon like the main character of the show. I believe the TV show is based on his memoir, Steve Jones, of being in Sex Pistols. It's kind of interesting, to I think he was also in the band before Johnny Rotten was as well, but it's sort of interesting to position it from his point of view, because in some ways, although he's got a very interesting story, he's one of the slightly milder characters in that he's merely just a bit of a teenage tearaway. He's not absolutely psychotic. So that kind of works as a framing device.
Just all the necessary relatable point of view character.
Yeah. Through which he sees all the chaos through. Yeah, like I say, the cast is absolutely strong. Maisie Williams is very good playing Rook, who's one of the people in Vivienne Westwood's posse of people working in her shop called Sex, which the name comes from.
Yeah, I've seen her being interviewed about it, I guess, out of curiosity, because it's one of her first parts since Game of Thrones. I assume it's not a huge part, is it? Or is she a major character?
No, she's, I guess, definitely a supporting character. Like I say, she's one of the people who works in Sex and sort of hangs around with Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood. Again, Tallulah Riley, who plays Vivienne Westwood, again, absolutely nails it. The accent and everything. Again, it shows how talented Maisie Williams is that her character has less scenes than some other people, but she really, always grabs your attention and, is very much a sort of larger-than-life presence. I guess partly because she's been in, the biggest show in the world, but yeah, there is something very arresting about her, that even when she's in the background of a scene, I think she's first introduced in the background of a bar where one of the first Sex Pistols gigs is going on, but yeah, your intention is instantly drawn towards her, so there's something about that magnetism that she has.
Cool. Glad she's still working.
Yep, so I can recommend this. So if you're looking for something to watch that's a bit different. Nick, what have you been watching recently that you can recommend?
Well, as often happens on this show, I just happen to have seen the first 2 episodes of the new Marvel Disney Plus show, so I guess we should probably talk about it. This, of course, is Ms. Marvel, the new series based on the comic from the 2010s about a teenage Pakistani-American girl who stumbles upon superpowers and inspired by, well, she hasn't actually got to this part of the TV show. Well, she's verging on it, I guess. But yeah, inspired by her enormous Marvel superhero fandom, she decides to, become a superhero. So yeah, this is Ms. Marvel. I've seen the first 2 episodes, and because we've already spoken about it off mic, I know Alistair has as well. And yeah, I thought this was pretty good. I think this certainly has the potential to be, I think I may have said this about Moon Knight as well, it's the line, I guess, probably the best of these since WandaVision. As with a lot of these things, it depends if they keep it up. A lot of these have a habit of going a bit meandering in the middle. I'll be watching episodes 3 and 4 with interest. But yeah, these first 2 episodes, they're a lot of fun. There's a lot of interesting visual stuff going on. It feels like there's a bit more thought going into the general style of it than sometimes goes into their shows where they just point the camera at people in a warehouse. The lead, Iman Vellani, is another casting masterstroke by Marvel. She's great. This is a big debut performance from her, and yeah, if she keeps this up and can push this into other roles, she's going to be pretty good, I imagine, pretty famous. And yeah, fundamentally it's just very enjoyable, very likeable, very charming, everything bops along. It actually has a certain amount of incidents in each episode. It has a large amount of characters, which I quite enjoy. I think one of the problems with these shows is they sometimes have about 3 or 4 characters. Ms. Marvel actually does feel like there's a whole world around the main character, Kamala Khan, and I think that does a lot to make this feel like a real TV show. So yeah, I'm really enjoying this so far. I hope it continues to be good.
Yeah, I'm also enjoying it. I think of the TV shows they've done so far, this one I think is the best encapsulation of the Marvel sauce they put on everything, in that it's actually really quite funny in places, and it kind of captures that sort of teenage awkwardness humour quite well, but not in a sort of super cringe way, more in a sort of quite charmingly endearing way. And Kamala Khan and the sort of people in her life are this large group of slightly eccentric people. So there's a lot of humour in the situations, as well as obviously the superhero action stuff. So actually, yeah, for one thing I really felt that this time they've got the tone pretty much spot on, which I really like. And I do kind of like how the sort of animation style, she's like an artist and likes to sketch and draw. There's always interesting things with the graffiti moving in the background as when she's walking past sort of walls in Jersey City, or kind of posters coming to life, which kind of, I don't know, it kind of makes the world seem a bit richer and more colourful, and because they're teenagers, there's a lot of texting or WhatsApping, but they've come up with a clever way of doing it, which is she'll send a message and something out of the background will sort of draw your attention towards it, which will be what she sent, such as like a neon sign lighting up to say like, how are you? Or again, a bit of graffiti will suddenly crystallize into like, my parents are a drag or something like that. And it is actually weirdly, I think, the best way of capturing and illustrating text message conversations, which is something TV and other visual mediums have really struggled with.
Yeah, no, it's impressively ambitious visually. The things like the text messages sort of appearing on her duvet or stuff like that. It's, as I say, it's a lot more sort of visual effort than you sometimes feel like Marvel put into these shows, which do sometimes feel like they're knocked off slightly on the cheap. It is, rewarded with the fact that it just feels like a much slicker, more exciting production.
Yeah. No, there's definitely something going on here. And it's interesting that this, obviously, character lives in a sort of Muslim community, Muslim Pakistani community. There was a great bit during like the Eid celebrations when it kind of goes through all the different like groups in her community, including like the Illuminantes who know all the gossip. And I don't know, there was like the Instagram bros or something like that.
All with little logos, yeah.
Yeah, all the little logos and stuff, again, the illustrations, and there was very religious teenagers. Yeah, the weird thing is, and it's all kind of filtered through sort of this, like, it's about what life's like in this sort of New Jersey Pakistani Muslim community, but also it's recognizable as any small community, sort of the people who gossip a lot, the cool kids who just want to be very cool, the people who are like the teenagers who got weirdly into religion or politics and stuff. It's one of those things that's kind of made it realize specific enough that they seem like real people and a real community, but it's also general enough that it's also relatable.
Yeah, I mean, there's a scene where Kamala Khan meets someone and they're talking about, I think, their favourite Bollywood films. And they just talk, like, specifically about several films, none of which I've heard of. No idea what they're talking about in any meaningful detail. But it still works, because, it's clear that they're interested in this, and it's a level of specificity that actually makes the characters feel more real.
Yeah, exactly. It won't date by using contemporary references, but also it's not just sort of so vague that it feels like these are just sort of placeholders.
Yeah, and in terms of what you were saying about this being a good example of the Marvel formula, I mean, this is something it's very much inherited from the original Ms. Marvel comics, which were by G. Willow Wilson and originally Adrian Alphona on art. And are great, by the way. They're very, very good. And what they're good at, very specifically, is the sort of Spider-Man formula. Like, if Ms. Marvel is anything, she's kind of a Spider-Man relatable teen superhero for the 2010s, 2020s. She is probably one of the last big versions of that archetype to really break out in comics. And, as someone who's a lifelong Spider-Man fan, I will take a new Spider-Man, even if they're neither spider-related nor a man.
Yeah, actually, I hadn't thought about that until you said it. But yeah, this has got massive Spider-Man vibes. The sort of friendly neighborhood superhero, small community. This time it's Jersey City, not Brooklyn.
Well, yeah, a lot of it is the sort of just superpower life rubbing up against real life stuff. In order to be Spider-Man, you've got to, miss your aunt's doctor's appointment because you're busy fighting Dr. Octopus, and then miss a date because you're busy stitching your costume. It's important that you have to, feel torn between your real life and your super secret life. Yeah,
which they capture very well in the show. Yeah, there's an interesting bit when she has to save a kid who's going to fall from the tower of the mosque because he's taking a really ill-advised selfie and leaning out of the window. I like the fact that like cell phones now and selfies mean that you got any excuse you like to have a character do something dumb so they need saving. It just doesn't need explanation. Yeah, he fell out of a tower. Why? He's trying to take a selfie. It's just kind of go-to explanation when you need some drama. But yeah, I guess, and you've got the same sort of thing when she's like trying to save someone who's in peril, but also keep her identity secret from her immediate friends, family, and community.
Yeah, and it's a sort of slow burn origin. Like, we're 2 episodes in, and she has not yet called herself Ms. Marvel or put on the Ms. Marvel costume you can see in all the promotional material. But I'm not yet getting impatient with it. It's ticking over this. It's moving along in a nice regular way. It hasn't yet started spinning its wheels and meandering annoyingly. And as I say, traditionally, the next couple of episodes is when that happens. Hopefully it won't.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, it's also, they've got the fact that she's a huge Captain Marvel fan and wears like a Captain Marvel cosplay suit to do with superheroes. Again, it's in this weird world. We'll come to more of this in the next segment when superheroes are both real but also like franchise things that people like. Like, they go to an Avengers convention and I guess it's very much like a regular sci-fi geek culture convention, but there's also the weird thing of like these people are also like real in this world. Like Captain Marvel is a real person as well as some form of media property.
Yeah, there's this vague feeling that everyone in the Marvel universe has seen all the Marvel films. Like, there are references to specific things they've done and said. Like, is there a t-shirt or a poster somewhere you can see in the background in Ms. Marvel referencing the famous America's Ass line?
Yeah, there is. That's America's Ass. And there's a bit when someone says something like, "I could do this all day," which is that's on the Avengers, isn't it?
It's Captain America, yeah.
He says it, and also that's also the song in the Steve Rogers musical.
Yeah.
From Hawkeye, that's called "I Could Do This All Day."
Yeah, so everyone's seen all the movies somehow. The closest to an explanation I think we're given is that Ant-Man has apparently been doing the podcast circuit.
Oh, yeah, that's what it's the Ant-Man podcast.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is very enjoyable. Very good, solid material. Honestly, if you only watch one Marvel TV show, then, I don't know, if you want to like one that's actually got some good sort of character-based drama, then maybe watch WandaVision. But if you just want some superhero fun, then honestly, watch this.
Yeah, no, it's good. And I think it really has sort of nailed that Marvel formula. And it reminds you that when they do it well, there's a reason why these films are so popular, because they're both fun, funny, and entertaining.
Yeah, hopefully it won't fuck it up in the next 4 episodes.
Next up this episode, we will be discussing Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers, based on the 90s cartoon. This show is set present day in a world where cartoons and humans coexist. A bit like Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Chip and Dale are washed-up actors following a falling out in the 90s that led to the cancellation of their TV show, Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers. That's the 90s cartoon that we're all familiar with. When co-star Monterey Jack is kidnapped and the police don't investigate, Chip and Dale must team up for a real-life rescue that might also be the showbiz comeback their careers need. This is a new film that mixes live action with different animation styles, as well as meta-commentary on animated films. We watched it on Disney Plus recently. Nick, what did you make of it?
Yeah, fundamentally this is definitely better and more interesting than you'd expect. It's a lot funnier than I expected. It's barely really a revival of Chip and Dale, but it's a very, very entertaining sort of prolonged metaphor about Hollywood and different styles of animation and the nature of comebacks. I mean, it's surprisingly scuzzy for a Disney film at times. The willingness to go into this sort of scuzzy underground of animation where, you know, the washed up animation characters, such as Chip and Dale, I guess, end up, is where a lot of the humour comes from here, and it is quite funny. I don't think it's quite as good as Roger Rabbit, simply because the characters don't land quite as well, but it is incredibly funny in some places. There are some very, very, very good jokes in this film. It's a nice tight 90 minutes. I had a good time.
Yeah, no, it's very good. It's very funny. I laughed throughout. It's very funnily written, and there's some great comedy performances in it. I think it's the sort of meta humor that makes it work really well. I was at some point thinking like who is this for? Because like it's like, you're right, it's definitely got this sort of scuzzy side to it, especially how kind of like Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Yeah, that is the this most apt comparison, that like has this sort of like film noir like vibe to it, almost like slightly Boogie Nights washed up sort of like Hollywood thing. But there's also like the humor is quite PG. There's very little like swearing or things in that, or like it's not particularly rude. So like you could quite probably content wise show this to like a 10, even 8-year-old, but I just think most like 90% of the humor would just fly over their heads because it's all like references. Like there's one bit that is really, really funny, that they visit the uncanny valley.
Oh god, yeah.
which is full of basically characters from sort of like early aughts animated things like Polar Express, when the CG was like too realistic to be cartoony but still like weirdly not right, and it just all looked kind of uncanny. And I was just thinking like the PG audience this film is kind of gunning for would basically probably not have been born when these films came out, and certainly not been aware of like the history of animation. So like this is all aimed at grown-ups in this sort of like children's cartoon sort of thing. And like there's lots of meta references. Like there's a film which is like Batman versus E.T. or something, which I suppose is a joke on Batman versus Superman Dawn of Justice and the kind of endless Marvel-esque crossover things. But yeah, I don't really think... I mean, I found it very, very funny and incredibly self-aware. And I did think that, like, this is just made for people like me, isn't it? This is just
made for people who are quite online and like the self-referential humour, yes. It's made for people who like memes.
Yeah, it's not just aimed at, like, grown-ups today. The references, obviously, things kids wouldn't get, even though it is ostensibly a kids' film. It's made up for, like, people who are into the discourse. Like, the character were Ugly Sonic, who's basically the version of Sonic from the first trailer for the new Sonic film when he looked a bit freaky. They've got that character in it for some reason, which only, even if you were aware of the Sonic film, you'd have to be aware of the discourse, how they changed the trailer, because Sonic looked like a monster at first.
Yeah, the conflict is between the fact that a lot of the jokes are basically cartoon references aimed at adults, and a lot of the plot is basically a fairly standard two friends learn to love each other again Disney plot. And there is a bit of discord between that, and there's not a huge amount of subversion in the plot, ultimately. It goes much the way you'd expect. I don't think it's a huge spoiler, I guess. I mean, I guess maybe you went into this film expecting a massive subversion, in which case I guess I have spoiled for you by saying there isn't one, in which case, bad luck. But yeah, that is an odd discord, but yeah, I guess in some level you could almost take it as part of the joke that this film has a quite conventional narrative, but lots of very, very subversive animation humour. But yeah, it is a bit strange.
Yeah, it is, like I say, like a quite straight up Disney film. Like, I was very much like, here are the beats from like any film format. It's not just Disney, it's like any kind of standard film writing format. Like, these are the beats. Like, this is the bit when they have to, like, they turn down the call to action or whatever. This is the bit where they're forced to change, and this is the bit when they discover the power of working together, or they're brought close together. This is the bit when their relationship's challenged. This is the bit when they, you kind of knew where the plot was going beat for beat. I did like the fact in terms of story that the story is basically it's a showbiz comeback story, but also it does have a Rescue Rangers plot to it, which is that someone's in peril and they need to rescue them using their sort of gadgets and disguises and things like that. So it is simultaneously a Rescue Rangers adventure, but set present day and also a Hollywood comeback story.
Yeah, I don't have any strong nostalgia for Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers, but when they played the animated intro from the original show towards the start of this film, I was like, oh my god, I remember this theme tune, and I vaguely remember almost every little clip in this intro.
Yeah, the sort of acid flashbacks you get to childhood when something triggers the nostalgia.
Yeah. Like I say, it's not something I have affection for, it's not as if this is the Teenage Mutant Turtles, but it was strange.
I used to watch Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers. Yeah, I don't know if it's one of like my favourite sort of like 90s children's cartoon shows. But I used to watch a lot of children's cartoons, actually, like loads. And yeah, I definitely remember this and used to watch it. I think it was a fun show and things like that. I mean, I don't really know how they'd have done like a modern straight up Rescue Rangers thing. It probably would have been a bit unforgettable. I mean, part of the meta joke is that Rescue Rangers weren't a character that kind of resonated and have been constantly reimagined and readapted, at least not in a high profile way. They had their moment in the 90s and has faded away, and I guess that's why there's not much appetite for like, should we just do another Rescue Rangers film? But I guess someone's like, well, what if we did this like meta commentary where they're washed up actors?
Well, yeah, I guess the main response to Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers is, oh yeah, I remember that. And I guess that's the joke of a lot of things in this film. There's a part of me that, has reached a point of like content cynicism where I find films where the main point is, look at all the references we managed to get. Look at all the characters / properties / voice actors we've shoved in. There's a part of me that's a bit wary of that. A bit. Is that it? Is that the joke? It's the thing. I mean, this film does actually, I think, usually attach an actual joke to the presence of these things. It doesn't just roll out the thing and go, look, thing, and then wave it off again.
Yeah, here's a bit of nostalgia for you.
Yeah, here's the thing you remember. There it is. Here's the next one.
Do the line, yes.
Do the line, say your thing. Yeah. Yeah, though I think there is usually enough commentary or an actual joke told with the references to justify it. But yeah, it is kind of still one of those films. Although I was, even at my level of cynicism, slightly taken aback for a few seconds that they managed to get a Batman joke, or in fact 2 Batman jokes, involving Batman actually appearing in a Disney film. It's nice that the two companies have put aside the differences and come together for this stupid film.
Yeah, I think they actually used a clip from Batman vs Superman for their Batman vs E.T. or wherever it was. Whereas, like, the range of references is just so much bigger than the Disney stable. I mean, like, this is owned by Disney, and Disney own like everything under the sun pretty much now, apart from the stuff that's owned by Warner Brothers. But yeah, there's a lot of Disney references to like classic Disney films pop up from like Snow White, the Seven Dwarfs, Jungle Book, all that sort of like thrown in. They've drawn all sorts of things. I don't know how they got this. Randy from South Park's like in the background at one point, and there's a bit when there's like The Simpsons, everything animated, like almost ever. Like there's all these, there's like references to like 30s black and white short animated things they'd screen before, features back in the day, those old cartoons. They crop up at various different points and things from like the 50s and 60s. There's a bit when there's a press conference and one of the journalists is like a character from like a 30s animated comic film, and he basically goes like, I can't really say their name, and they're from Black and White News, which I thought was quite funny. It's just like a non-stop reel of like anything, not just like nostalgia. There's loads of like 80s nostalgia, like Transformers type things and whatever turn up, but it goes all the way back to like the 30s and 40s, 50s, like in minor ways and in background characters.
Yeah, no, I'm not as well versed in Hollywood stuff as you probably are, and I'm sure I missed some Easter eggs, but even I could tell there were a lot of them. Especially as a sort of convention sequence, where there's actually a convention sequence at the beginning and at the end for maximum nostalgia exposure. And yeah, those are obviously very reference heavy.
Yeah. Everything from like Thundercats to like Sonic is kind of chucked in, yeah.
Yeah, He-Man and Skeletor lock up at one point, it's all in there.
It does lean more on the sort of 80s, 90s nostalgia again, because this is sort of clearly aimed at people of our generation. But yeah, it does cover the whole history of animation pretty much. And one of the things I did really like about it is also the way it like mixes all these styles together. I mean, it must have been like forever in After Effects using as many plugins as possible to get all the different animation styles to mesh together and look realistic. In this world where like it's just not really commented on, again, like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, that like there were just like people and there are like cartoons as well, and they're in school together and like, you know, are in shops and running businesses, but they do mix all the sort of stuff together. Like it's Dale from Chip and Dale is now CG'd himself, which I guess is like equivalent to having plastic surgery, I guess, in their world. So he looks like fresh and modern. And there's like mixing in hand-drawn styles, like Chip is still drawn like a 90s cartoon character. There's like a Muppet at one point. The police chief is a sort of stop motion Wallace and Gromit-esque kind of character. There's obviously human actors as well. The fact that it all like meshes together, and there's no point when like you could tell that like that's a person not interacting with something that's not there. It always looks convincing when someone like, I don't know, grabs hold of a cartoon character or
it does look very nice and very like carefully rendered, yeah. I mean, I think most of the time it leans on just being, you know, cartoons interacting with cartoons, because I'm guessing that's a lot probably cheaper and easier to film than having to try and get people to interact with cartoons. But hey, whatever works. It's a film about cartoons.
Yeah, and you have to have little things like, I remember reading an interview with like Bob Hoskins when he did Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and he had to be careful that whenever he grabbed Roger Rabbit, he had to close his hands so there was no gap between his fingers, or else the animators had to paint Roger Rabbit's like neck between his fingers, which would take hours and cost huge amounts of money. I'm sure this wasn't easy to make. There's a lot of good jokes as well, and basically kind of how this would work sort of thing, because like they're chipmunk-sized characters, so they live in like tiny houses that have like regular land plot, but just in a tiny house in it. And some people have like tiny cars, and some people have like regular sized cars. And there's the bit that gets the plot going. When you go to Monterey Jack's flat, it's in a sort of regular size, well, it looks like a regular apartment block, but it's for like chipmunk sized people. So when a human talks to them, they kind of loom at the sort of 8-story window, which is just that when you realise it's kind of difficult to describe about watching it, but like it's that kind of, the humour is like the perspective shift that you kind of thought you were in a world where everything was normal size and they were like rodents. But no, actually, they're rodents in a human-sized world living in a rodent-sized tower. So that there's like a giant human face at the window. I don't know. They're making humour like, how would this actually work, and wouldn't it just be really weird some of the time?
The answer being yes, apparently, yeah.
Yeah. Or like there's an animated car that drops off tiny little cars at school and things like that. It's deeply silly, this film. It's deeply, deeply silly.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a lot more to it than that, but it is very silly and very funny. Considering this is a film heavily involving the Lonely Island, and, you know, good work again, lads. You're always funny. But I was kind of disappointed there was very little comedy music.
There was one bit when they tried comedy rapping, but it goes badly wrong.
Yeah.
But I did think that a film coming from the Lonely Island people, I knew it was quite likely to be very funny and also likely to be very silly, which is what it does deliver.
Yeah. I did watch Bob Chipman's review of this, and he did point out that arguably the main message of this film is that messing with Disney's copyrights is analogous to human trafficking, which is certainly a message. But
yeah, they don't go as far to say that, like, the plotline about people being bootlegged is quite funny, how, like, yeah, the human trafficking getting bootlegged, but also they don't go as far to say that, like, they get shipped out to China, but they don't say it's China, but it is a bit like Chinese knockoffs of, like, Western copyrights are, like, not only, like, I don't know, bad, but, like, deeply immoral, and, like, they are, like, basically equivalent of, like, selling people into slavery. Like,
exactly,
okay.
You know, we may have been implying that this film is silly and has no message, but really it does have that message.
Yeah, the message is...
Don't touch our copyrights, you're basically a slave driver.
Yeah. There is even one bit when they, like, you see the bootleg people getting crammed into, like, a shipping container and then, like, shipped off somewhere. And it's like, well, that's supposed to be going to China, aren't they? It doesn't say that. That's the joke.
Yeah, it's a funny comedy. You don't seem to get that many straight-up comedies nowadays, but this is very much one of those, and it was nice to see.
Yeah, if you find meta humor like, oh, it's that thing that, like, kind of a bit tedious, and nostalgia a bit tedious, I would actually say this is worth watching because it is straight up funny. It's got a really high density of well thought out jokes.
Yeah, I have grown cynical about endless reference humour. I haven't seen any of those Wreck-It Ralph films because it just sounds enough. But yeah, though this is good. The references are actually used for jokes. It's funny.
finally, this episode, we'll be discussing Step by Bloody Step, a new comic from Cy Spurrier and Matthias Bergara. A girl awakes without memory or language. Her only protection from the harsh world of monsters and human armies is a mysterious armoured giant. As they go on their journey across the world, they meet people who desire the girl and her strange magical abilities, and her relationship with the giant is tested. This 4-part comic contains no dialogue or written language. It's an interesting innovation. We read it recently. Nick, what did you think of it?
Yeah, I enjoyed this a lot. I always enjoy Cy Spurrier's work, which is why we've covered it a few times on the podcast. But yeah, this is obviously an interesting one for him as a writer because there's no text, or at least no legible, readable text. So yeah, it does mean that Spurrier is having to tell the story more through what he can convey just in the artwork. And fortunately, Matthias Bergara is very much up to the task here. Like it's a combination of sort of gorgeous landscapes and fantasy material and really, really good character acting. Like the fact that Bergara can easily sell like really nuanced, layered character emotions and reactions and levels of complicated feeling is one of the reasons why this works as well as it does. It's a somewhat simpler story than some of Cy Spurrier's work, which is obviously by necessity. There's only so much complexity upon complexity upon complexity you can stack with no dialogue. But, you know, considering there's no dialogue, it is actually quite a nuanced, complicated story, especially towards the end, which I guess I'll endeavour not to spoil, because there's really no need, I don't think. But yeah, it is a good story with a good ending. It's got this sort of mythological fable feeling that I always enjoy, and the fantasy world is very, very well imagined and gorgeously rendered. A fun time.
Yeah, I thought this was very good as well. It really showcases that a writer for a comic does way more than just add dialogue. They kind of create story and structure, and I guess the kind of all the big stuff that's kind of remains invisible but is the sort of essence of storytelling. Things that we don't often think about apart from people who review stories, like, you know, it's very well paced, for example, and like the revelations come at kind of the right point. You know, we were talking about in Chippendale how you can see the kind of story format unfolding like a very kind of like straightforward kind of story. And although this story isn't like a sort of straight up Hollywood film plot as Chippendale had, but as you're reading it, you kind of, even though there's no dialogue, you get the sense of the kind of regular story progression. So, for example, the first issue ends with a character having to resolve a conflict by making a difficult decision, and which is a standard storytelling end of episode or end of issue moment, but it's all conveyed without dialogue, but it's still very much present.
Yeah, I think, as I say, part of what it's doing to get by with no dialogue is leaning on story convention or fables, or the idea that we sort of know this story or how this story works. Obviously, you know, the big buff warrior and the little child is a bit of a trope, a bit of a convention. Mandalorian, blah blah blah. In fact, I think, and now Obi-Wan Kenobi also doing something similar. So it's very much leaning on the fact that, yes, once you've seen the basic setup of this child and this giant knight thing, you know roughly what sort of story you're getting, and you can sort of go through with that, which it then also leans on towards the end when it veers away from it, or at least veers off on a slightly more offbeat, unusual course.
Yes, and also unlike Chippendale, it does sort of, subvert your expectations in the final issue. Again, best not to spoil it, but there's this element of, the story goes in an unexpected direction. It takes the story you think you're getting and you get something slightly different.
Yeah, I mean, as you kind of expect from a lot of Cy Spurrier's stuff, there's a sort of elegance of construction here. Yeah, it still makes complete sort of sense in a sort of looping way. I mean, to be honest, some of his stories sometimes verge on getting a bit convoluted, so if anything, having no dialogue has forced him to really whittle it down to this basic, simple, understandable structure, and it comes across very strongly as a result. And obviously, a lot of that is Matthias Bergara, who is doing amazing stuff here. There's a lot of double-page spreads or single pages just to let him, put across the landscape. It's gorgeous work. A+.
Yeah, no, the art is absolutely beautiful, and is obviously the primarily thing showcased here. It does so much of the storytelling. I kind of like how it's sort of a slightly abstract style. It looks almost like a bit sketchy, but like it's not sketchy as in like dodgy or like, the guy trying to sell you some weed out the back of a pub. Not that kind of sketchy. Like, the art looks like it's kind of quickly hand-drawn, but I'm sure there's like an enormous amount of skill and technical knowledge has gone into making this have this kind of look that it's a bit sketchy. It's really the only way to describe it. It's got that slightly abstract quality to it, but like it kind of gives it a sense of, especially in the action scenes, it gives it a sense of motion and energy and speed that I'm sure, again, like I say, I'm sure a lot of technical skill has gone into exactly conveying those feelings it wants to get across. But at the same time, it's got this slightly abstract technical approach.
Well, yeah, I mean, some comic art is quite heavily rendered, lots and lots of tiny little lines and cross-hatching and stuff to make the objects seem really heavy and big, in, I don't know, some comics starring massive badass superheroes or whatever, Spawn, say, you do get a lot of that, but in the other end of the spectrum, there's a lot of this sort of lightness, this sort of putting across a lot with as few lines as possible. And yeah, I mean, I've worked with artists like that, not to, big up myself as an expert too much, but yeah, and there is, a lot of prep that goes into that. You usually go through a few prep sketches before going to the final version. And yeah, the final version is, just a few lines, but there's a lot of planning that goes into those lines.
Yeah, and it really reminds me actually of a lot of abstract art that you see, sort of in art galleries as well, that like there's a sort of efficiency and a sort of, simplicity to the point it's trying to make, and you can convey a lot of feelings and emotions and sort of abstract concepts through being abstract and allowing the reader or the viewer to think like, I know this isn't exactly like, it's not like I'm looking at a photograph, of what this scene would be like if it was real. I'm looking at something that conveys the emotion of what it would be like to be there. That's what we're communicating on this kind of emotional level. Not like I'm a fly on the wall, more like I'm in the middle of it, experiencing what the characters are experiencing.
Well, yeah, and this fantasy landscape they're in, obviously it's not, elaborated on at length because there's no exposition, because, again, there's no dialogue. But the way they use the sort of landscape is, without having to explain it, it's almost metaphorical in itself. Like, they can just have the landscape be whatever colour or shape it needs to be to put across the feeling in a scene. Like, there's a lot of, like, big landscapes or montages and stuff where just the colour of the landscape is changing in a way that illustrates the mood, just because they can, really.
Yeah. And I think there's, in terms of the storytelling, it's a sort of, a lot is left to the imagination in terms of like the world building and stuff. As you say, there isn't much broader exposition, but I like the fact that a lot of the details are left ambiguous. There's no heavy-handed exposition. There's no maiden butler dialogue. And considering sometimes I feel there's too much of that in popular culture, or basically like we must explain what the thing is and how it works, which is like, no, explain it if it's plot relevant or if there's a good way to convey that. But, when you don't have to, leave it up to the reader's imagination. That can be much more effective. And this broad strokes approach to world building and storytelling actually works really well, and it's one of the things I really liked about it, that like I didn't need to know what these armies are or what these creatures are. The story has what I need to know in it, and I can just, the rest, like my imagination can fill in.
Yeah, you don't necessarily need to understand it all, as long as you understand what the story is and how you're meant to feel, which, again, especially when you haven't got words, I think you just have to pull back and trust the audience a bit, I think. Yeah, and it works, and it's great. And there was one part in, I think, issue 3, where they introduced an incidental character who looked, at first glance, a bit too similar to the main character, the main sort of little girl character, which led to me being momentarily confused for a couple of pages and having to flick back a bit and go, wait, you what, huh? But, yeah, I got past that. It was fun.
I thought that was deliberate, though. There was supposed to be, because it's plot relevant, the confusion, isn't it?
Oh, okay.
I don't know.
Okay, I got the confusion, but I didn't realise the confusion was meant to be in story. Fair enough. Okay, I take it back. Cy Spurrier and Mateus Bagava are smarter than me.
Not necessarily, unless I've misunderstood it. I mean, again, it's the thing with a story that has no dialogue. We keep coming back to this, but it is the main feature of the thing, that your interpretation of the story is, again, you're imagining the story, you're interpreting it your own way. There isn't heavy-handed bits when it says this is what you're supposed to feel at this point. This is what you're supposed to imagine at this point. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, but as I say, if that is meant to be intentional, fair enough. I did have the sort of, wait, hang on, is that? But yeah, I didn't quite get that was meant to be an in-story confusion. Fair enough.
Yeah, I think it's a case of, there's a sort of plot line involves case of mistaken identity. There is something about this world that's like, the whole world is very, very consistent. And I'm sure, again, it's the classic thing, like a lot of thought has gone into it. But obviously, only the kind of bits you need to see are kind of conveyed. So although there's no dialogue in it, some of the characters do have language. And they talk to each other, but the little speech bubbles have kind of just symbols that are obviously completely unrecognizable to us, which is where showing there is language in this world, but the main characters can't understand it, so they can't communicate. But there is a consistency to the language, because you notice the same symbols are reused. There's one that appears to be some kind of greeting, It's kind of looks a bit like a T. You'll notice it reappears in things. So the language is actually thought through. They're not just random symbols that are just drawn in the dialogue thing. There's actually a consistency to it. And I think that holds true for a lot of the world building, but it's not made explicit. It's just there for you to kind of pick up on.
Yeah, and I saw in the credits they credited someone with designing the sort of glyph system they use for the few bits of speech bubble. So yeah, there's definitely a system and some work in there.
Yeah, and which is again part of the whole... The world is as complexly drawn as a story with dialogue in it, but they've just worked out the world and then fed through what you get from the character's perspective, which I think that's a sign of really strong writing, when you know what to leave out. You understand the world enough that it's consistent, but also you're good enough writer to know what you leave out and the audience don't need or can have it sort of slightly obscured.
So yeah, no, this was good. If you like this book, Spurrier and Bergara also did a series called Coda together, which was a 12-issue maxi series from a couple of years ago, complete with text. And yeah, that obviously does give them a chance to explore a world in more depth with, both more pages and actual words. Also a good bit of work. The idea of Coda is that it's sort of a world set after this sort of massive fantasy war. It's a sort of aftermath story. It's good stuff.
That does sound interesting, yeah. Again, a slightly different take on the fantasy stories we're used to.
Yeah, but one that still gives Bergara a chance to draw lots of these obviously sort of amazing landscapes. Okay, and that was this fortnight's Moderate Fantasy Violence. Thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed that experience, then please go to moderatefantasyviolence.com and you can find more of it in both audio and written form. And if you still enjoy us after that, why not go to your podcast provider of choice and leave us a nice 5-star review. Thank you in advance.
You can also find more from us on Twitter, where we are at MFV Podcast, and follow us on Facebook by searching for Moderate Fantasy Violence. You can get more from me on Twitter, where I'm at Alistair J.R. Ball, or find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com.
And you can get more from me at nickbryan.com on the internet, or nickmb on Twitter, including the second issue of my Death of a Necromancer series, which is very, very nearly ready to be unleashed on the world. And you can also come back in 2 weeks for the next episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence, in which we will be loading up on the premium telly with Disney Plus's Obi-Wan Kenobi and HBO's We Own This City. Thank you very much. See you then. Bye.
Bye.